Let the day fall behind you. Find your comfort and let your mind begin to slow. Gently, we'll wander into Pluckley, a quiet English village said to hold many restless souls. If you find rest here, subscribe, and a new one will be ready each night. In the year 1086, in the dry administrative language of Norman governance, a clerk working somewhere in the machinery of William the Conqueror's great survey set down the name of a small agricultural holding in the district of Ashford, in the county of Kent. The name he wrote was Pluckley. It appears in the Domesday Book among hundreds of similar entries, a modest settlement of modest value, its fields assessed, its people counted at the remove of a bureaucratic process, its worth to the crown recorded in the precise indifferent language of taxation. There is nothing unusual in the entry. It sits in its column like a stone in a wall, ordinary and stable, doing the work that stones do. Pluckley, the name carries the breath of an older English through its syllables, a sound that became Pluckley over the following centuries, in the way that place names in England tend to shift and settle, wearing down to something easier on the tongue without losing the underlying shape of what they were. The village it describes sits in the low hills of the Kent Weald, a landscape of heavy clay soil, oak woodland, and narrow winding lanes that have been running in roughly their current directions for a very long time. The Weald as a whole is old country. The Romans knew it, the Saxons farmed it, the Normans catalogued it, and the people who came after all of them found a landscape that did not change quickly, because the clay did not invite quick change. It held the past in it the way clay holds an impression, the outline of things that have already happened, still visible long after the event. The Domesday entry for Pluckley records a settlement held in part by the Archbishop of Canterbury, which places the village inside one of the great institutional structures of medieval English life from very nearly its first appearance in the written record. To be held by the Archbishop was to be attached to Canterbury Cathedral, to the most powerful religious institution in England, to a web of administration and patronage that extended from Rome in one direction and from the humblest Kentish field in the other. The Archbishop's land holdings across Kent were extensive, and Pluckley was one small piece of a very large arrangement. The villagers would have known their land was held in this way, and would have known what that meant for the tithes they paid and the authority that governed them. The church was not an abstraction in a medieval Kentish village, it was the framework of the year. The clerk who wrote the name Pluckley was not writing a story. He was writing an account. The difference matters. An account records what is there, the taxable value, the number of plowlands, the relationship of the holding to the greater structures above it. A story would have told the listener something about the lives of the people in those fields, the way the light fell across the Weald in the late summer, the sound of the lanes in the early morning before the working day had properly started. The Domesday Book contains no stories. What it contains is the outline of a world that can be held in the hand like a map, the shape of the place without the texture of it. Pluckley is there. The people are there, in the aggregate, in the numbers. The rest would have to come from somewhere else. It comes, in Pluckley's case, from the long centuries that followed, from the families who settled into the village and stayed, from the institutions they built and maintained, from the social and economic patterns that gave the landscape its particular character and gave the people within it their particular stories. All of these are part of the record, if a different kind of record, not the clean clerical script of the Domesday Survey, but the accumulated residue of a community living in one place across a very long time. Church registers, estate accounts, architectural decisions made by wealthy families and worked out in stone and brick by the skilled craftsmen they employed. The record of a village is not contained in any single document. It is spread across all of them, and it deepens the longer the village stands. Standing in Pluckley on a gray Kentish morning, looking down one of the village's narrow lanes, a particular detail becomes apparent quite quickly. The windows are wrong, that is, in the sense that they do not match what a visitor might expect from an English village of comparable age and comparable geography. Where neighboring settlements in the Weald carry the standard vocabulary of the English vernacular building tradition, square-headed lights, straight lintels, the flat geometry of functional construction, Pluckley's estate cottages and residential properties carry something different. The windows are arched, not pointed in the Gothic manner, not flat in the Georgian manner, but rounded or oval, their frames following a gentle curve that sets each building apart from the surrounding countryside and from every other village within reasonable distance. A lane in Pluckley looks like nowhere else in the Weald. This is not an accident. The arched windows are the signature of the Daring family, the family that would come to define Pluckley more completely than any other single force in its post-Domesday history. The Darings acquired extensive land holdings in the village during the medieval period and maintained their grip on those land holdings across many subsequent generations, exercising the kind of sustained, long-term influence over a community that is only possible when wealth and property remain in the same hands across centuries. Their principal seat was Surrendon Daring, a house that stood at the heart of the Daring estate and that remained the physical expression of the family's local power for as long as the family remained a living presence in the village. From Surrendon Daring, the Darings administered their land, received the rents that sustained their position, and exercised the various legal and social rights that came with the ownership of a substantial rural estate in England. Among those rights was the advowson of St. Nicholas Church, the right to appoint the priest of the parish. This was not a trivial power. The incumbent of a rural parish in England was, in many respects, the second most important figure in the community after the largest landowner, and in a village where the largest landowner held the advowson, the two roles were effectively linked in a chain of patronage and obligation. The priest appointed by the Daring family would have been aware of that appointment and of what it meant. The relationship between the church and the estate was not adversarial in a village like Pluckley. It was structural. The Darings gave the church its priest, and the church gave the Darings the spiritual administration of their tenantry, and both parties understood the arrangement and worked within it. The advowson passing from generation to generation of Darings, recorded on vellum or parchment in the language of ecclesiastical law, is one of the details through which the family's long history in the village becomes tangible, a document conferring a right, passed from hand to hand across the centuries, conferring the same right in each generation until the estate that supported it was no longer there to support anything. The arched windows represent a different kind of mark. They are an aesthetic decision made at some point during the 18th or 19th century, when the Darings were engaged in the renovation and construction of estate properties, and they are sufficiently consistent across the surviving buildings to suggest that the family, or an architect working consistently to their specifications, enforced the motif as a deliberate stylistic signature. To walk through Pluckley today is to read the Daring family's presence in the buildings themselves. The windows identify each property as part of the estate as clearly as a coat of arms on a gate pier. They give the village a visual coherence that is, in a literal architectural sense, the product of one family's taste applied consistently across several generations of building activity. The rounded frame in the stone, soft, particular, slightly unexpected, is the daring family making their mark on the village in the medium most likely to outlast them. On a gray morning, with the low light coming in across the Kentish clay and the hedgerows still damp from the night, those arched windows catch the light in a way that draws the eye and holds it. The clay-heavy land around Pluckley shaped the village's economy in ways that are worth understanding before anything else is considered about the place. This was not historically easy agricultural land. The wheeled clay is heavy and poorly draining, prone to becoming waterlogged in wet seasons and cracking in dry ones, and it requires more effort to work productively than the lighter, better draining soils of other parts of England. The farmers who worked this land knew its character and adapted their methods to it, growing the crops it would support and raising the livestock it could sustain, but always with the understanding that the land itself was demanding. Hop cultivation was a major component of the local agricultural economy from the early modern period onward, the vines climbing their tall frameworks in long parallel rows across the fields of the Weald in a pattern that defined the summer and autumn landscape of the region for several centuries. Hop gardens are a particular site, structured in a way that has something almost architectural about it, the tall poles and wires giving the field the character of an outdoor room, the vines growing up and over in a canopy of green that traps the light in the late summer months when the harvest is approaching. Beyond hop cultivation, the clay itself was productive in its own right. The Weald's clay deposits supported a small-scale brick-making industry, with local brickworks processing the raw material of the landscape into the building material of the villages and farms. Brick production using Weald clay was an unglamorous, physically demanding industry that left particular traces in the landscape: the clay pits from which raw material was extracted, the drying sheds and kilns where bricks were fired, the flat-bottomed depressions that remained in the earth long after the industry had moved on or been abandoned. These traces remain in the landscape around Pluckley, and one of them, the area of the former brickworks at Pinnock, sits in the geography of the village in a way that connects the industrial history of the place to the later stories that attach themselves to it. But the industry itself, the clay being extracted and processed and fired into brick, is simply the record of people doing the work that the land made available to them. The Weald's brick industry employed men who lived in the surrounding villages and left their mark on the landscape in the same way that the Deering family left their mark on the architecture, permanently and in a medium that outlasted the work itself. There is a pattern in all of this that is worth following. Pluckley is not a place where the ground is blank. It is a place where the ground has been marked, repeatedly and in different registers, by the people who lived and worked and built and died within it. The Archbishop's Holding, the Daring family's Advowson, the hop gardens' structured rows, the clay pits left by the brickworks. Each of these is a layer of human activity laid down in a specific period and persisting in some form into the present. A village that has been inhabited for nearly 1,000 years of documented history, and for longer than that in the undocumented period before the Domesday Survey, carries its history and its landscape in ways that are not always visible at first, but that become apparent when the attention is held on the place long enough to take them in. All of this, the Domesday Entry, the Daring family, the Advowson, the hop gardens, the clay pits, is the substrate beneath the reputation that Pluckley carries now, and that it has carried since at least the middle of the 20th century. That reputation is specific. It is precise enough, in fact, to have been printed in a reference book. The Guinness World Records, at some point in the latter part of the 20th century, cited Pluckley as the most haunted village in England. The designation came with a number, 12. 12 named or described apparitions, a canonical count of ghosts assembled from a combination of local testimony, published ghost guides, and journalistic accounts, and fixed into print in a reference volume read by millions of people across many decades. 12 is a satisfying number in the way that counts tend to be satisfying when they are precise enough to be stated with confidence. It has the quality of a census figure, not approximate, not hedged, not offered as a range, but given as a total. 12 ghosts. The most haunted village in England. The authority of the Guinness World Records, which for decades occupied a particular position in the culture as an arbiter of superlatives. The fastest, the tallest, the oldest, the most, lent the designation a quality of official confirmation that the underlying sources, taken individually, might not have supported. Those sources were local testimony, ghost guides published by small regional presses, and newspaper articles, many of them appearing around the Halloween period, and written to a template that favored enumeration and local color over methodological rigor. The researchers who compiled the count, wherever they sat and however they went about their work, were not conducting a formal investigation. They were not applying a consistent standard of evidential weight to each tradition, not distinguishing between ghost stories reported by multiple independent witnesses and ghost stories that had passed through several generations of oral retelling before being committed to print. They were assembling a list from available sources, counting the named or described figures on that list, and arriving at a total. The total was 12. The total was printed. The total has been in print ever since. It is worth pausing on this for a moment without drawing any stronger conclusion than the facts support. Local historians and researchers looking at the Pluckley ghost traditions have noted that the count of 12 is not the only defensible count. Depending on how variant traditions are treated, whether two similar figures reported from overlapping locations are counted as one ghost, or two, whether a tradition that appears in one source but not others is included or excluded, the total could reasonably be arrived at as fewer than 12 or as many as 15. The number is not mathematically wrong. It is simply the product of a particular set of curatorial decisions applied to a body of material that does not have clean edges. Ghost traditions are not naturally amenable to census taking. They overlap, they evolve, they split into variants, and collapse back into single figures across the generations of telling, and they resist the kind of sharp categorization that produces a definitive count. And yet 12 is the number. It is in the book. Pluckley is the most haunted village in England, and it has 12 ghosts, and this has been part of the public record long enough now that the number has become part of the village, the same way the arched windows are part of the village, a visible feature, immediately apparent, that sets the place apart from every comparable settlement in the Weald, and that draws the eye before any history is known. The village that appears in the Domesday Book as Pluckley, a modest agricultural holding of modest value in the Ashford district of Kent, held in part by the Archbishop of Canterbury, recorded in the dry clerical Latin of Norman administration, is the same village that appears in the Guinness World Records as the most haunted place of its kind in England. 900 years separate the two entries. Both are in their different ways acts of recording. Both fix the village in a document and give it a particular character within that document, a taxable asset in the first, a superlative category in the second. The village itself sits between those two records, neither of which entirely captures it, carrying its clay-heavy fields and its hop gardens and its arched deering windows and its 12 named or described apparitions through the gray Kentish mornings and the quiet autumn afternoons with the equanimity of a place that has been many things in the course of a very long time and has learned, in the way that old places learn things, simply to continue. The hop gardens that stretched away from the village across the heavy Wilden clay were a specific and demanding feature of this landscape for a very long time. A hop garden in full growth in late summer is a remarkable thing to encounter. The vines climbing their frameworks in long parallel rows, the whole field rising above head height in a canopy of green that moves and shifts in the wind in ways that flat-lying crops do not. The air carrying the particular dense fragrance of the plant as the harvest approaches. The seasonal rhythm of the hop harvest was one of the defining rhythms of the village year, bringing temporary workers into the area, filling the lanes with carts, connecting the quiet of the agricultural weald to the wider economies of the breweries and markets that purchased what the fields produced. A village connected to hop cultivation was a village with a seasonal pulse, busy in one part of the year, quieter in another, the fields alternately full and bare as the agricultural calendar turned. The clay-heavy character of the farmland around Pluckley was not simply an agricultural condition, it was a physical environment that produced a particular quality of existence. The roads were heavy in wet weather, movement between settlements was slower and more effortful than in lighter soiled country. The land dried slowly in spring and held the cold of winter longer than ground with better drainage. This is the environment in which the village's social life took place across the centuries documented in the historical record. The lanes, the church, the public house, the estate properties, the farmland, the former brickworks, all of these exist within a landscape that is physically distinctive and that has shaped the human activities played out within it in ways that are difficult to separate from the activities themselves. A place does not simply provide a backdrop for the events that happen in it. It participates in them, slowly and without intention, the way all landscapes participate in the lives of the people who inhabit them over long periods. The Church of St. Nicholas stands in Pluckley as it has stood for centuries. The daring family monuments within it, recording the passage of that family through the village in the medium of stone, names and dates carved into the surfaces that have absorbed the light of the building for longer than anyone now living can personally remember. The advows on that passed from generation to generation of Durings made the church partly a During institution, and the monuments that fill the interior make that connection visible in a way that architectural style alone cannot. Stone endures. The During windows endure. The records in the Domesday Book endure, in the document's own survival across the centuries. A village that has been inhabited for as long as Pluckley has accumulated a great deal of enduring material, and the enduring material becomes, over time, the ground from which everything else grows. The Guinness World Records designation, when it came, attached to a place that already had all of this behind it: the agricultural history, the estate history, the ecclesiastical history, the industrial history, the specific physical character of the wheeled clay, and the hop gardens, and the narrow lanes with their high hedgerows pressing close on either side. The 12 ghosts, assembled from local testimony and newspaper accounts, and published ghost guides, arrived in a landscape that had been building its character across 900 years of documented existence, and longer still in the undocumented time before the clerks arrived with their surveys. Whether 12 is the exactly right count, whether the traditions behind the count are old or recent, whether the sources that produced the list were rigorous or impressionistic, none of this changes the fact that the number, once printed, became part of what Pluckley is. It became part of the record in the way that the Domesday entry is part of the record, A document fixes something. The fixing may not be perfect, but what is fixed stays fixed, at least as long as the document survives. Pluckley, the most haunted village in England, with 12 ghosts. The designation sits in the reference book with the same matter-of-fact authority as every other entry in that book. The fastest runner, the deepest lake, the oldest building. It is there. It has been there long enough now that the count of 12 has become inseparable from the village, the way the arched windows are inseparable from it, the way the name Pluckley is inseparable from the column in which the clerk set it down in 1086. A number arrived at from newspaper cuttings and local testimony, precise enough to be printed in a record book, is carried by a village of arched windows and clay-heavy farmland and daring family monuments and hop gardens stretching away in long parallel rows, and the village has been carrying that number, quietly and without complaint, ever since. The view down one of Pluckley's narrow lanes in the early afternoon, high hedgerows pressing close on both sides, the lane surface still damp from overnight rain, the arched windows of the estate cottages just visible at the far end. This is the landscape in which all of the documentation sits. The Domesday entry is there, in the ground's long history. The During family is there, in the windows and the monuments. The hop gardens are there, in the field patterns, and the memory of the seasonal workers who passed through. The count of 12 is there too, in a reference book in a library somewhere, or on a website that has reproduced the entry, or in the minds of the many thousands of people who have visited the village with that number already in their knowledge before they arrived. All of these layers occupy the same small square of Kentish landscape, the same clay soil, the same gray light coming in low across the weald on a morning when the hedgerows are still damp and the lane is quiet, and the arched windows catch whatever brightness is available and hold it, briefly, before the cloud moves over and the light changes and the village settles back into its ordinary, recorded, extraordinary quiet. The clerk who wrote Pluckley in 1086 was recording a settlement of modest agricultural value in the Ashford district of Kent. The editors who printed the count of 12 were recording the most haunted village in England. Both were doing the same thing in their different centuries and their different registers, setting a name down, giving a place its description, adding one more layer to the record that the village has been accumulating, slowly and continuously, since before either of them arrived to make their notes. The record continues. The number is in the book. Pluckley is still there, its lanes damp in the early morning, its arched windows still catching the low gray light of a Kentish day. The count of 12 sitting in the public record, with all the quiet authority of a fact that has been in print long enough to stop requiring explanation. The interior of St. Nicholas Church holds a particular quality of light in the late afternoon, not golden, not warm, but the specific gray-white of a Kentish sky, coming through old glass and falling without preference across stone floors, carved monuments, and the long horizontal faces of the ledger stones set into the nave. The church dates in its present form largely from the 13th and 14th centuries, though portions of the fabric are older, and the walls carry the accumulated sponsorship of the Daring family across many generations. Tablets, heraldic carving, and the names of the dead set into the stone, with the unhurried confidence of a family that expected to be here for a very long time. It is in this building, in this specific interior, that the first and most frequently cited of Pluckley's ghost traditions is located. The figure known as the White Lady has been reported near the church across many decades of accumulated eyewitness accounts, and the story attached to her is among the most precisely elaborated in the village's canonical list. The tradition holds that a woman of the Daring family was interred here within the church itself, sealed inside not one coffin, but several. Accounts vary in the total they give, ranging between 3 and 7 nested layers, and that the stated purpose of this extraordinary arrangement was either to preserve her beauty or to prevent her spirit from wandering after death. The version that insists on the beauty preservation explanation is the older and more frequently cited form of the story. The version that stresses containment of the spirit appears somewhat later in the recorded tradition and carries a different emotional weight, though neither version can be traced to a specific named individual in the Doring family's documented records, nor to a specific entry in the parish register or the estate papers. What the tradition offers is not a name or a date, but a circumstance, a woman, a family, a church, and a burial more elaborate than the ordinary dead required. No documentary source establishes her identity. The Doring monuments inside St. Nicholas carry names, dates, and epitaphs. None of them, as far as researchers have established, corresponds with certainty to the woman of the nested coffins. The story persists without that anchor, and has persisted for long enough that the absence of a name has ceased to matter to the tradition. The pale female figure reported near the north wall of the church's interior, or near the entrance, or simply somewhere within the building, is described across accounts in terms that remain broadly consistent. A pale, standing form, sometimes moving, sometimes still, sometimes noticed only in peripheral vision and gone when the observer turned to look directly. These reports span many decades. They arrive from visitors, from locals, from people who had heard nothing of the tradition, and from people who had known it since childhood. The detail of the multiple coffins is worth dwelling on for a moment, not for its strangeness alone, but for what it represents in the architecture of a ghost tradition. A story that explains why a ghost exists is a different kind of story from one that merely reports an apparition. The nested coffins are an explanation. They account for the White Lady's presence, give her a reason to remain, and situate her within the specific social world of a wealthy rural family whose relationship to death was shaped by faith, by the economics of burial, and by the anxieties any family carries about what the dead might do if not properly managed. Whether the coffins existed in any physical sense has not been established. The story, carrying the weight it does, has persisted without that confirmation. The second figure associated with St. Nicholas is the one called the Red Lady, and her tradition runs parallel to the White Lady's in ways that have led some researchers to suggest the two were once aspects of a single story that diverged across retellings. The Red Lady is also described as a Doring family woman. Her defining characteristic is not an unusual burial, but a loss, a child, whose death is the source of whatever binds her to the churchyard. She is reported among the graves in the older sections of St. Nicholas churchyard, the part where the headstones have been in the clay long enough to lean slightly from vertical, their inscriptions faded to something that requires particular attention to read. The apparition is described in a red dress, or surrounded by a reddish light, or simply suffused with a warmth of color that sets her apart from the gray of the stone and the green of the grass around her. The shared Daring family context, the shared church location, and, in some versions of the tradition, the shared detail of an extraordinary burial have led researchers to note the possibility of conflation. Two legends that were originally distinct, circulating in the same community, slowly acquiring each other's features across generations of retelling until they are difficult to hold apart. The tradition does not confirm this. Neither figure has been established as corresponding to a documented historical individual, and the question of whether they are two legends or one legend that divided remains open. What the tradition does offer is something specific and mappable: a woman in red, moving slowly among the older graves in the section of the churchyard where the ground is damp and the stones are old. That image has remained stable across the accounts that have been collected. The grief attached to it, a mother who lost a child, gives the figure an emotional particularity that the White Lady, sealed in her elaborate burial, does not quite have in the same way. The Red Lady is searching. That is the word several accounts reach for. Not wandering, not haunting in the aimless sense the word implies in common use. Searching, the boundary between the church interior and the churchyard, represents a shift in the kind of landscape the ghost traditions occupy. Inside the church, the daring monuments and the ledger stones give the space a specific documented human history. The churchyard, older in some of its sections than the current fabric of the building, opens onto a wider, less legible past. The clay soil of Kent is not gentle to burials. The older the grave, the more the ground has worked on it. The headstones in the churchyard's earliest sections lean and tilt, not from neglect, but from the slow mechanical action of the earth itself, and the inscriptions wear away in the particular manner of Kentish stone exposed to Kentish weather, which is damp and patient and removes things gradually. The temperature in the older section of the churchyard is noted in several paranormal investigation reports as consistently lower than in the more recent sections, and investigators have observed that the area around the north door of the church produces the most frequently reported anomalous perceptions. None of these observations has been formally correlated with historical burial records, and the temperature differential has not been attributed to a mechanism that investigation accounts have settled on. The reports simply note it. The cold is there, or is reported to be there, and the figure in red moves through it, and the accounts accumulate. From the churchyard, the landscape of Pluckley's ghost traditions extends outward into the working countryside of the Weald. The third named figure on the canonical list is the one associated with the former brickworks at Pinnock, and this tradition belongs to a very different social world from the During family church. The Weald's clay deposits made brick production a natural local industry, and the brickworks at Pinnock were a working site where men labored in the particular conditions of clay extraction: the wet, heavy digging, the loading and hauling, the kilns, and the clay pits that were a persistent industrial hazard. The tradition holds that a worker died here in an accident. The specific nature of the accident varies between accounts, with falling into a clay pit being the most frequently cited version, and entrapment being another, and that his screams at the moment of his death or at the moment of his dying were loud enough and particular enough to leave something in the landscape. The ghost associated with this place is not a figure seen, but a sound heard. The screaming, witnesses report, is audible from the area of the former brickworks at night, or in atmospheric conditions that the accounts describe as still and damp, the kind of Kentish night when sound carries differently than it does in wind. The overgrown state of the Pinnock site in its current form gives the tradition a specific physical texture. The old clay pits are present in the landscape as depressions, filled over time with vegetation, their original industrial purpose no longer readable without prior knowledge. The wind moving over these earthworks and through the remnant structures of the site produces sounds that investigation accounts have described with some consistency as ambiguous. Sounds that at first hearing, in the dark, require a moment to identify with confidence as wind rather than something else. Whether this acoustic property of the site is sufficient to explain the screaming tradition, or whether the tradition itself shapes how the sounds are heard by people who know the story before they arrive, is a question that the accounts do not settle. Both possibilities remain available. The Screaming Man is a tradition without a confirmed name or a confirmed date. The accident, if it occurred, left no record that researchers have produced. What remains is the sound, or the reported sound, and the site where the clay pits are still present in the ground. The fourth figure in the canonical list occupies a different kind of landscape again, not a church, not an industrial site, but a road. Fright Corner is a bend on a minor rural road south of Pluckley, and its name appears in exactly that form on local maps, printed in the same typeface and with the same matter-of-fact authority as every other topographical feature on the sheet. The name is not recent. It belongs to a tradition of English place names that encode old stories in compressed form, names that record what happened at a particular spot without elaboration or explanation, trusting that the people who use the map will know what the name means. The ghost associated with Fright Corner is the Highwayman, and the form the tradition takes is consistent with what is known about the history of Kentish roads in the 17th and 18th centuries. Kent's roads during this period were documented sites of highway robbery and violent death. The county's position between London and the Channel ports made certain routes economically significant in ways that attracted both legitimate traffic and the criminals who preyed on it. The Decibel's records for Kent across this period contain prosecutions, convictions, and executions relating to highway robbery, and the landscape retains in its place names a compressed memory of the dangers that travel once carried. Fright Corner belongs to this class of place name. The tradition that grew around it describes a cloaked mounted figure, a highwayman in the recognizable English folkloric type, or alternatively, a threatening shadowy presence felt rather than seen. At the bend in the road where the lane narrows and the visibility is limited and the hedge presses close on both sides. What witnesses have reported at Fright Corner across the decades of accounts that have accumulated includes a figure on horseback, seen at a distance, visible for long enough to be registered, and then not there, a shadow that moved against the direction of the light, and a quality of unease at the location that several accounts describe as distinct from the general unease of walking a dark rural road at night. These experiences are reported and filed. The question of whether they correspond to a specific historical event, a robbery, a death, an execution on the road, has not been settled by any documentary source researchers have produced. The name on the map predates the current round of paranormal interest in the village by a considerable period. Whether the name gave rise to the ghost tradition or reflects an older story that was already circulating when the map was made is not established. Both possibilities leave the tradition intact. The lane still curves, the name still appears on the map, and the hedge still presses close in both directions along that particular stretch of road. The figure of the highwayman belongs to a recognizable English type, the mounted criminal of the road, romanticized in popular literature, but grounded in the historical reality of highway robbery as a documented feature of pre-modern English travel. The ghost at Fright Corner draws on this type and sets it in a specific place, that the tradition has a name printed on a map, and that the name means what it means, is itself a form of documentation. Not documentation of the supernatural, but documentation of a story's age and local authority. A name that reaches a map has been in circulation long enough to be considered stable. The highwayman of Fright Corner has been there in that form since before anyone now living arrived in Pluckley. The fifth figure in the village's canonical list is among the most particular in her physical description, and she belongs to a social category quite different from the During family women of the churchyard or the unnamed laborer of the brickworks. The gypsy woman's tradition is associated with an old oak tree on the edge of the village, at the margin between the lane and an open field, the kind of tree that has been in that position long enough for its roots to have extended well into the surrounding clay, and for its trunk to carry the particular texture of old Kentish oak bark, ridged and damp and dark at the base where the roots meet the ground. The story holds that a traveling woman died beside this tree, possibly from cold, possibly from an injury the accounts do not specify with consistency, and that her spirit remains near the tree's roots. The apparition is described with a specificity that distinguishes it from the churchyard figures. She is reported seated at the base of the tree or near it, and sometimes described as smoking a pipe. This detail, the pipe, is notable because it grounds the figure in a particular social reality. A woman seated at the base of an oak tree at the field edge, smoking a pipe, is not the kind of image that arises from abstract supernatural tradition. It has the texture of a real person placed in a real setting by witnesses who observed something they have tried to describe accurately. Whether the description reflects a historical individual, a recurrent visual experience, or a story shaped by repeated retelling is not established. What remains is the specific image: a woman, a tree, a pipe, the late afternoon light falling across the clay at the field's edge. The gypsy woman belongs to a recognized English tradition of roadside haunting, a category in which the figures who appear are characteristically people who died in transitional or liminal spaces rather than in the settled domestic or institutional spaces where most deaths occurred. Roads, field edges, stream crossings, woodland margins, these are the places where English ghost tradition most frequently places the wandering dead, and the reason has been discussed by folklorists in terms of the social logic of haunting. The dead who are not contained by a churchyard burial, who died outside the structures that normally manage death, who left the world in spaces that were defined by movement rather than permanence. A traveler who died at the field's edge, not in a parish church, nor in a household bed, occupies the precise social and geographic position that the tradition assigns to the unquiet dead. The oak tree carries her tradition because trees of that age and size were already understood as significant in the folk landscape of the Weald, not sacred in any formal or ecclesiastical sense, but weighted with accumulated significance in the way that very old trees acquire it, simply by outlasting the lives of all the people who have stood near them. The tree at the field edge, in the specific case of the gypsy woman's oak, has been in that position long enough to have become part of how the village orients itself. People give directions with it. Its name, insofar as the tree has a name, is the tree near where the gypsy woman died. Whether the tradition came before that naming or arrived with it is impossible now to determine. The 5 figures considered here, the white lady in the church, the red lady in the churchyard, the screaming man at the brickworks, the highwayman at Fright Corner, and the gypsy woman at the oak, are not the entirety of Pluckley's canonical list. The full count as it appears in the reference record reaches 12, and the remaining figures occupy other specific locations across the village and its surrounding lanes and farms. A colonel, a schoolmaster, a miller, a monk, a phantom coach, a watercress woman. Each has a location and a story. Each has accumulated its own set of reported experiences and its own body of accounts. The count of 12 is itself a figure worth examining, not as a precise empirical total, but as a product of the same process that generated the individual traditions, stories circulating in a community, shaping themselves around places and events and social memories, gradually achieving the kind of stability that allows them to be listed and counted. The locations of the 5 figures already described span the village's principal social landscapes: the church of the ruling family, the industrial site of the working poor, the road where travelers were at risk, the field edge where a transient woman died without a parish to bury her. The distribution is not random. These are the places where the conditions for haunting, as the tradition understands them, were most likely to arise, places marked by violent or untimely death, by social marginality, by the presence of individuals whose passing left something unresolved in the landscape. The daring women are in the church because the church was the daring family's institution. The laborer is at the clay pit because that is where industrial accidents happened. The highwayman is at the road bend because that is where the road was dangerous. The gypsy woman is at the oak because that is where she died, outside the structures that would have given her death a different kind of ending. Each of these 5 locations has been visited by investigators, photographed by journalists, described in ghost guides, and marked on the informal maps that circulate among people who arrive in Pluckley specifically because of its reputation. The visits have not resolved the traditions. They have, in many cases, deepened them, adding new accounts to the existing record, new reports of sounds at the brickworks, new descriptions of figures in the churchyard, new experiences at Fright Corner that match and slightly extend the canonical descriptions. The traditions are not fixed in the sense that they stopped growing. They are fixed in the sense that their central images have remained stable across a considerable period. The pale woman near the north wall, the searching figure in red, the scream from the clay pit, the mounted shadow at the road bend, the seated woman at the tree's base. The question of what these traditions document, whether they record the persistence of the dead in specific places or the persistence of stories in the minds of people who inhabit and visit those places, or something in the gap between those 2 possibilities that neither description quite reaches, is not settled by the accounts themselves. The accounts are what they are, descriptions of experiences, filed by people who had them in a village that has been accumulating such descriptions for a very long time. The experiences are reported, the locations are documented, the figures have names, or at least the names the tradition has given them, and the canonical list, having settled at 12, continues to be cited as though the number were a property of the place rather than a product of the counting. The gypsy woman's oak stands at the field edge, in late autumn stripped of its leaves, its bark damp in the way Kentish oak bark is always damp once October is past, its roots spreading wide into the clay at the margin between the lane and the open ground. The tradition attached to it is older than any of the investigators who have arrived with their equipment, older than any of the journalists who have photographed the church and the lanes, and older than the designation in the reference book that printed the number 12 and sent it out into the world as a settled fact. The tree has been there throughout all of that. The tradition has circulated around it and been retold and traveled outward and returned, and the tree itself has not moved or changed in any way that the accumulation of accounts has documented. Something died here, the tradition says, near this tree, in this field margin, at some point that no parish record specifies, and the figure associated with that death has remained, seated, still, occasionally observed by people who were not expecting to see anything, in the space between the lane and the open clay ground, in the particular quality of autumn light that falls across a Kentish field edge in the late afternoon and makes the distance between things seem briefly smaller than it is. That this tree, in that field, carries that name and that story, and has carried them for longer than anyone now in Pluckley can verify from their own memory or from any document that has been produced to researchers, that is the condition in which the tradition stands. It is not confirmed. It is not dismissed. It simply persists, the way the clay persists, and the lane persists, and the oak persists. Rooted in the same ground it has always occupied, carrying its associations quietly into another year. In the early 1990s, a film crew arrived in Pluckley with equipment cases and cables, and the particular organized disruption that location filming brings to any quiet place. The lanes were narrow. The light was low and gray in the way of Kent in autumn. The rounded windows of the estate cottages caught that light at angles the camera operators found worth recording. Within a few years, those lanes and that church and those distinctive arched frames would be known to millions of people who had never visited the village, who had no prior knowledge of its history, and who would encounter its name again, this time in connection with something quite different from the domestic comedies of the Larkin family. The ITV series broadcast between 1991 and 1993 drew national audiences across its 3 seasons, and the village it filmed in became nationally recognizable scenery. That recognizability worked as a kind of multiplication. Visitors who arrived looking for the farms and lanes of a beloved television series moved through a village that already had another reputation circulating alongside the first one, a reputation far older than any film schedule, passed between locals in the way that such things are always passed, at the pub counter, at the garden gate, in the direction a hand points when a visitor asks what happened in that field. The 2 reputations ran parallel for a while, and then they began to interact in ways that are now quite difficult to disentangle. What is clear is that by the mid-1990s, Pluckley was carrying far more national visibility than a small Kentish agricultural village would ordinarily carry, and that visibility was available to anyone who wanted to attach something to it. What got attached in substantial part was a ghost hunting industry that had been developing its own infrastructure and its own methodology across the same decade. Paranormal investigation as an organized commercial activity, with paid overnight events and published findings, found in Pluckley, a location already prepared for it, a village with named sites, a canonical count, a Guinness World Records designation, and the residual national profile of a television series. From the late 1990s onward, commercial paranormal investigation companies began listing Pluckley events in their schedules. The church was one location. The old brickwork site at Pinnock was another. The road bend with its printed name on local maps drew investigators to stand on it after dark and record whatever the darkness and the wind and the audio equipment produced between them. A new layer of documentation began accumulating over the existing one, adding reports from thermal cameras and electromagnetic field meters to the older layer of local testimony and journalistic accounts. The equipment used at these events was consistent with the broader paranormal investigation community's standard practice of the period. Electromagnetic field meters, sometimes called EMF meters, were used to detect fluctuations in ambient electromagnetic fields, which some investigators interpreted as indicating the presence of entities. Audio recording devices ran continuously at each named location, capturing ambient sound and later processed in search of anomalous content. Infrared and thermal imaging cameras documented temperature variation across the sites in visual formats that could be published and examined afterward. The appeal of such equipment to an investigation team is legible enough in the dark, in an old building, on a site carrying decades of reported incidents. A device that produces a reading at a particular moment provides something concrete to note and to file. Whether what is noted and filed represents what investigators hope to document is the question that sits at the center of the field, and it has not been resolved. The Pinnock brickwork site drew consistent attention from investigation groups. The site itself is overgrown, the clay pits now long redundant, the physical infrastructure of the brickworks dissolved into the landscape over the decades since production ceased. Wind moving over open clay pits and through the remnant earthworks produces sounds that the surrounding landscape amplifies and distorts. Investigators who have worked the site at night have noted that certain wind conditions generate ambient noise that requires active assessment before it can be categorized. Audio recorders left running at the site have produced files that investigators have labeled and filed as anomalous, and that skeptics have attributed to natural acoustic effects in a landscape shaped by extraction and subsequent abandonment. Neither account is without basis. Both rest on the same recordings. The church at St. Nicholas drew the largest share of investigation interest over this period, both because of its prominence in the named ghost traditions and because of its age and physical character. Stone buildings of the age of St. Nicholas Church have particular acoustic properties. They amplify certain frequencies and carry sound in ways that can be unexpected to a visitor standing inside at night. Temperature variation within old stone buildings is a documented physical reality, with cold spots produced by draft patterns, floor geometry, and the thermal mass of thick stone walls responding slowly to ambient temperature change. Investigation groups recorded temperature anomalies within the church at coordinates corresponding to the areas of historically reported activity, and the reports they produced noted these anomalies as potentially significant. The difficulty of establishing significance in the absence of a controlled baseline is one the reports generally acknowledged. The Black Horse Inn has functioned throughout this period as a kind of informal center of gravity for everyone with an interest in Pluckley's reputation. The sociological function of a pub in a haunted village is not incidental to how ghost traditions persist. A pub is where people talk, where visitors ask questions and locals decide how to answer them, where the canonical version of a story is reproduced and occasionally extended, where a newcomer hears the count of 12 for the first time and asks how the number was arrived at, and receives an answer that has been delivered often enough to be smooth. The Black Horse has been this kind of place, a gathering point where the oral tradition stays alive, not in any fixed or official form, but in the version that the evening's conversation produces, which is always slightly different from the version the previous evening produced, and always clearly recognizable as the same tradition. What is documented about the Black Horse is partly its physical presence as a named location in ghost guide accounts and investigation reports, and partly its function as the place where visitors to Pluckley tend to begin and end their evenings. Investigators arriving for an overnight event stop there before the event begins. Locals who have lived alongside the village's reputation for decades drink there and answer questions according to their own relationship to the stories, which varies considerably. Some are enthusiastic, some are indifferent, some are mildly tired of the whole apparatus, but willing to point a visitor in the right direction. The tradition is carried forward by all of these people equally, regardless of how each individual holds the material personally. The newspaper coverage of Pluckley's haunted reputation began substantially earlier than the commercial investigation industry. British national and regional newspapers had been running features on the village at intervals across the latter half of the 20th century, and the template for those features was established early enough that later versions of them are immediately recognizable as instances of the same form. A photograph of the churchyard, a headline with a count, a list of named ghosts, a quote from a local. The articles appeared most reliably around the last days of October, when the subject matter had an obvious editorial hook, and their consistent format meant that each new piece effectively republished the canonical list in a form that reached a fresh audience, people who had never heard of Pluckley and who encountered its ghost count for the first time in a tabloid feature over breakfast or in a regional supplement tucked into a Saturday paper. The Daily Mail ran features on Pluckley at various points across this period. So did the Sun. Kentish local press, with its closer knowledge of the village and its readership's existing familiarity with the area, produced coverage that tended to be somewhat more attentive to the specific sites and to local voices, but followed a recognizably similar structure. What the newspaper coverage did over time was less to introduce new material than to stabilize the existing count. Each feature that named 12 ghosts and listed them made the number 12 slightly more fixed than it had been before. Each photograph of the churchyard, composed to show the oldest headstones at their most dramatic angle, made that particular framing of the location slightly more canonical. The visual and verbal grammar of the Pluckley ghost story as a media object was established by repetition into something that now carries the stability of a well-worn form. The Ghost Club, one of England's oldest organizations dedicated to the investigation of claimed paranormal phenomena, had Pluckley on its map well before the commercial investigation industry arrived. Established investigators and independent researchers worked the village sites across the middle decades of the 20th century, producing case files and personal accounts that fed into the journalistic coverage and were in turn fed by it. The record accumulating from both directions simultaneously, each new account aware of the accounts that preceded it, and inevitably shaped by that awareness. It is not possible to find a Pluckley investigation report from any era that was conducted in complete ignorance of the prior tradition, because by the time any investigator arrived in the village, the tradition had already been publicly documented in enough detail that neutrality of approach would have required an active effort to achieve and then to maintain. This is one of the methodological difficulties that serious researchers in this field have consistently acknowledged. An investigator who knows that a particular area of the church is associated with the White Lady tradition, who has read the prior accounts before arriving and stands in that area at night with a thermal camera running, is in a different situation from a hypothetical investigator with no prior knowledge at all. The knowledge does not make the subsequent experience fabricated. What the witness described, they described. What the equipment recorded, it recorded. The question is what relationship the report has to the prior tradition, whether a report filed in full knowledge of the existing accounts can be cleanly distinguished from one that would have been filed anyway. It is a question that sits inside every investigation report produced in Pluckley, acknowledged with varying degrees of explicitness. Commercial ghost tourism around the village developed in parallel with the investigation industry and has continued alongside it in a relationship that is more symbiotic than competitive. A visitor who attends a paid overnight event at the church and subsequently writes an online account of the experience contributes to the same public record as an independent researcher filing findings with an established organization. The distinction between the two is meaningful for some purposes and immaterial for others. Both produce documents. Both are read by subsequent visitors who arrive with those documents in mind. The record grows from both sources equally, and the canonical list of sites and traditions is reinforced by both with equal consistency. Ghost tourism in English villages with established paranormal reputations follows a pattern that Pluckley represents in a particularly well-developed form. A location acquires a reputation from some combination of local tradition and published account. That reputation attracts investigators. The investigators produce reports that are published and attract further visitors. The visitors produce their own accounts, which expand the literature and increase the location's visibility. Commercial operators arrive to organize and monetize the visits that are already happening. The visibility produced by the commercial operation attracts media coverage that reaches people who had no prior interest in the subject and who become, through that coverage, the next wave of visitors. The cycle is self-reinforcing and does not require any single actor to be insincere for the whole apparatus to function and to continue expanding. What is notable about Pluckley within this pattern is the stability of the canonical count. The number that appeared in the Guinness World Records entry has remained the number most consistently cited across all subsequent coverage, even though researchers and local historians who have examined the source traditions carefully have noted that the total is not as fixed as the printed figure suggests. The same landscape of oral tradition and journalistic account that produced 12 could, handled differently, produce fewer than 12 or as many as 15. Traditions that partially overlap, two figures associated with the church who share biographical details, might be counted as one tradition or as two, depending on the methodological decision applied. Variant accounts of a single apparition seen at different locations might be recorded as separate ghost reports or as variant sightings of the same figure. None of these decisions was made through formal methodology. The number 12 arrived at a printed figure through a process that involved selection, editorial judgment, and the particular moment at which someone stopped counting and submitted a claim. The Guinness World Records entry is itself an interesting document in the sociology of reputation. The organization receives claims, evaluates them against available evidence, and prints a figure in a reference book that is then cited as authoritative. For a haunted village, the available evidence is a body of journalistic accounts, local testimony, and ghost guide publications, sources whose own evidentiary standards vary considerably. The entry for Pluckley as the most haunted village in England was compiled from exactly these sources, and the number 12 that it printed was drawn from the same compilation. Once printed, the number acquired the authority that a printed figure in an official record carries, which is substantially greater than the authority of the oral tradition from which it was drawn. 12 ghosts in the Guinness World Records is a different kind of claim from 12 ghosts mentioned in a Kentish newspaper. The first carries institutional weight. The second carries local color. The content is identical. This is how numbers in ghost lore tend to consolidate. A figure that begins in local oral tradition, accumulates across journalistic repetition, and eventually reaches a formal publication is not a different figure at each stage, but the weight it carries at each stage is substantially different. The 12 that circulates in Pluckley now is the 12 of the official record, not the 12 of the original count. Even though both refer to the same landscape of stories told about the same village across the same period of time, the number has become part of the place's identity in the way that Fright Corner's name on the map has become part of the lane's identity, not because the print is the thing itself, but because the print has been consulted and repeated long enough that the distinction between the name and the thing begins to lose its practical weight. The village's landscape of named sites has a physical durability that the ghost traditions depend on. The lane bends are still there. The churchyard is still there. The old brickwork site, overgrown and quiet, is still there at Pinnock. These are real places on a real map, and their presence in the landscape gives the investigation reports and the ghost guide listings a kind of geographical anchor that keeps the traditions located and specific in a way that purely textual ghost traditions sometimes are not. A visitor can stand at the named location and stand in the same physical space where prior visitors stood and reported something. The reports are layered over a real place. The place holds them. The investigation event listings that commercial operators published across the late 1990s and into the following decades shared a consistent format: a location name, a date and time, a price, a column of the named sites that would be visited during the night: the church, the brickworks, Fright Corner, the oak at the field edge. Each named location had accumulated enough prior reports by the time it appeared in a commercial listing that the listing itself was already a condensed archive, a shorthand pointing toward a body of accounts that any visitor arriving with prior knowledge would already be carrying. New investigators arrived at each site, understanding what prior investigators had reported there, which is the condition that makes confirmation a predictable outcome and surprise a genuine achievement. This does not mean that what people reported at these sites was constructed or insincere. The experience of standing at the Pinnock Brickworks at 2 in the morning with a thermal camera and an audio recorder in the dark, with wind moving over old clay pits in the particular way wind moves over that landscape, is a real experience. What the body produces under those conditions, the low hum of attention, the peripheral sharpening that comes with low light, the auditory system processing ambient sound with greater care than it would in a familiar and well-lit room, is real physiology operating on real sensory input in a real place. What people file in their reports is what they experienced. The gap between experience and explanation is where the open question lives, and it has lived there, in Pluckley, through decades of visits by investigators carrying increasingly sophisticated equipment, without narrowing in any settled way. The accumulation of those reports across 30 years of commercial investigation activity represents a substantial body of documentation. Files of time-stamped audio recordings, sorted thermal images, EMF readings logged by location and time, personal accounts written the morning after events and submitted to databases that have been maintained and expanded by the organizations running them. No single investigation has produced evidence that has been formally accepted by an independent scientific body as demonstrating anything beyond the range of known physical processes. No single investigation has demonstrated that nothing anomalous occurred. The reports sit in their files, adding up to a record that is large, consistent in its locations, and unresolved in its central questions, which is, for a researcher approaching the field with appropriate care, what a body of evidence in an open field looks like. The national newspaper coverage resumed at intervals across this whole period, new features cycling through the same template, the same churchyard photographed at the same angle, the same 12 ghosts listed in the same order, the same count cited with the same attribution to the same record book. The coverage was not cynical in the way that the word is sometimes applied to tabloid journalism about paranormal subjects. The villages these features describe are real places. The traditions they document are real traditions. The people who live alongside those traditions and speak to journalists about them are speaking genuinely about a landscape they know well. What the template does is not fabricate but simplify, reducing a complex, historically layered body of local knowledge to a format that will read clearly in the space of a newspaper feature, which is a different thing from dishonesty, even if it produces a different picture from the one that a longer account would give. The ghost guides published about Pluckley across this period occupy a middle position between the journalistic features and the formal investigation reports. Books dedicated to the haunted villages and buildings of Kent, chapters covering Pluckley alongside other notable sites in the county, self-published accounts by dedicated investigators, All of these contribute to the same growing body of documentation without fitting neatly into either the journalistic or the scientific category. Their evidentiary standards vary. Their relationship to prior sources varies. Their reach into the reading public that produces the next wave of visitors varies in ways that are difficult to track. What they share is the canonical list of named sites and the count of 12, reproduced in each new publication in a form that has accumulated the authority of repetition without having been arrived at by any method that would satisfy a formal standard of verification. The village has absorbed all of this documentation with the quiet durability of a place that has been here much longer than any of it. The lanes are still narrow, the hedgerows still press close on both sides. The light in early autumn is still low and gray in the way of the Weald. The church at St. Nicholas still has its stirring monuments and its ledger stones and its east window, throwing light across the floor in the particular way it has done for several hundred years. The brickwork site at Pinnock is still overgrown and quiet, the wind still moving over it in the way that produces the sounds that investigation reports have labeled and filed and left unresolved. Fright Corner still bends in the road to the south of the village, its name still printed on local maps in the same matter-of-fact typeface as every other topographical feature. The Guinness World Records entry printed 12. That figure moved through newspaper features and ghost guides and investigation listings and online databases in the years that followed, becoming in the process something closer to a fixed property of the place than a count arrived at from a set of sources. Visitors arriving in Pluckley now arrive knowing the number before they walk the first lane. They carry it in with them, the way a long-established number is always carried, not as something to be tested, but as something to be located. 12 sites, 12 traditions, a village that has been counting its ghosts long enough that the count has become, in a practical sense, as permanent a feature of the landscape as any of the buildings it names. The case files continue to accumulate. The event listings continue to be published each season. The newspaper features continue to appear in late October, the same churchyard photographed, the same figure repeated, the landscape of the village absorbing each new layer of documentation, the way clay absorbs rain, slowly, quietly, without visible alteration. The count of 12, drawn from newspaper cuttings and local testimony, and printed in a reference book that has now been cited often enough that the citation itself is part of the tradition, has been in print long enough that it has settled into the landscape of Pluckley, the way a name settles into a lane or a bend settles into a road. It is there when the investigators arrive and there when they leave. It was there before the cameras came, and it is there after they go. The village carries it quietly, the way it carries everything else, the history, the architecture, the clay-heavy earth, simply continuing as it has always continued, without requiring any particular conclusion to be reached. In the summer of 1878, a man arrived on foot at a village in the Kent Weald, carrying a notebook and a letter of introduction from the Folklore Society of London. His name does not survive in the published accounts with any consistency, but his notes do, compressed, careful handwriting, recording what an elderly woman told him about a particular stream crossing at the edge of a wood where the water moved over flat stones in a way she described as deliberate, as though the stream were choosing its path. She had not attended church regularly for some years, she explained, and she did not find this inconsistent with her beliefs about the stream. The collector wrote this down without editorial comment. He was there to record what persisted, not to correct it. The Folklore Society had been founded in 1878, the same year that Collector made his Kentish journey. and its earliest field workers found in the Weald, something they had not found with the same density in more accessible parts of England. The geographic character of the region had kept it comparatively isolated for a long time. The clay soils that made farming difficult also made road building difficult, and the dense secondary woodland that covered much of the high Weald created a landscape of small clearings and narrow lanes in which communities had remained largely self-referential across generations. What the collectors recorded in their Kentish notebooks were beliefs that had been fading in Surrey and Essex for 50 years already. Survivals, as the Folklore Society called them, of a pre-Christian understanding of the landscape in which particular places held particular presences. Sacred trees were documented across multiple Kentish parishes, not sacred in any formal sense, not associated with any named deity, but understood by the people who lived near them to require attention, to be spoken to or around or about with a certain quality of care that distinguished them from other trees of the same species growing 50 yards away. The distinction was not explained. It simply existed, and had existed for as long as the oldest informants could remember their own grandparents describing. The collectors noted this carefully. They noted that the locations of such trees were often at boundaries between common land and enclosed field, between parish and parish, between the managed margin of a village and the open woodland beyond. The boundary function was consistent enough to be remarked upon in the published summaries that followed the fieldwork, though no fully satisfying explanation for it was offered at the time. Water sources carried their own set of associations. Springs that rose in particular spots were understood to have qualities that changed depending on the time of year, the state of the sky, or the circumstances of the person approaching them. This was not superstition in the dismissive sense in which that word was sometimes applied by outside observers. It was a practical epistemology, an inherited set of observations about specific places that had been refined over a very long period of time. The folklore collector's notebook recorded a woman in an Ashford district village who described the spring at the edge of her family's land in terms that were precise and specific: its color in March, its sound in August, the way the grass around its mouth grew differently from the grass 3 feet away. She was not describing something frightening. She was describing something known, something that had a character and a history that she understood herself to be the current keeper of. Hilltops and elevated ground carried a different quality in the Kentish folk record, not so much inhabited as exposed, places where the ordinary insulation of the landscape fell away, and the atmosphere became thinner in some sense that was difficult to articulate, but consistently reported. Collectors found this motif repeated in parishes that had no documented communication with each other, which was one of the things that interested the Folklore Society most. The consistency of independent records from geographically separated communities suggested that the beliefs being documented were not locally invented, but locally preserved from something older and more widely distributed. The collectors were careful not to make large claims about what that older source had been. They noted the pattern and moved on to the next notebook entry. The boundary places mattered particularly. Where a lane crossed a stream, where a parish boundary met a woodland edge, where a road divided and a traveler had to choose a direction, these were the locations that accumulated the most concentrated attention in the folk record. The attention was not always frightening. Some of it was practical. Certain crossroads were better for a particular kind of weather reading. Certain stream crossings were noted as reliable or unreliable depending on the season. But embedded within the practical knowledge was another layer, an understanding that these were places where the ordinary rules of the landscape were slightly less stable, where the categories that organized daily life sat less firmly on the ground. A crossroads was a decision made permanent in stone and clay. It was, by its nature, a place where more than one direction was simultaneously real. The legal practice of burying suicides and executed criminals at crossroads was still active in England at the turn of the 19th century, and it remained so until the Burial of Suicide Act of 1823 brought it formally to a close. The practice was grounded in the folk belief that the confusion of directions at a crossroad junction would prevent a restless or troubled ghost from finding its way back to the living. A spirit that woke beneath a crossroads would not know which path to take, and in that indecision would remain fixed and contained. This was not a peripheral or eccentric tradition. It was a widely distributed English custom, documented across many counties, practiced with the full knowledge of local authorities, and understood by the communities in which it occurred as a practical form of spiritual management. The body was placed at the crossroads, specifically because the crossroads was understood to work, because the landscape itself was understood to have properties that could be applied to a specific problem. Within that framework, the road bend known as Fright Corner, south of Pluckley, belongs to a tradition that is much older than the name printed on the local map. The highwayman tradition associated with the location, a cloaked figure, a threatening presence at the bend in the lane, draws on a documented reality of Kentish roads in the 17th and 18th centuries, when highway robbery was a sufficiently serious concern to appear regularly in assize records and in the correspondence of travelers. Violent death on a Kentish road in that period was not a rare event. What happened to the bodies of those who died in such circumstances, or who were executed for causing such deaths, was a matter of documented legal and community practice. A crossroads or a sharp bend on a dangerous road was exactly the kind of place at which the folk record expected a presence to remain, not out of any incapacity in the dead, but out of the consistent logic of a belief system that understood place and spirit as mutually constitutive. The wheeled soil is clay, and clay holds its shape long after the events that disturbed it have ceased to be visible on the surface. The Folklore Society collectors noted this too, the way that Kentish informants understood the landscape as a surface over something considerably more durable than the surface, a palimpsest in which older patterns were not erased, but covered, still present, and still occasionally legible. The stream crossing that the elderly woman described to the 1878 collector had a history she attributed to a period she could not date, somewhere before her grandmother's time, when something had happened there that she could not specify, but whose consequence was the quality the stream still had. The collector recorded this without skepticism and without endorsement. He wrote down what was said, in the language in which it was said, and moved on. Hope cultivation introduced a particular social dynamic into villages like Pluckley that the folk record has not always fully accounted for. From the 16th century onward, the hop gardens of the Kent Weald required seasonal labor on a scale that the local population could not supply alone, and the annual harvest brought large numbers of workers from outside the region, from the poorer districts of London primarily, and from Ireland, crossing in considerable numbers from the mid-19th century onward. These workers camped in fields and farm buildings across the village landscape, living in temporary structures at the margins of the agricultural world they had come to work in. They were present in substantial numbers for the duration of the harvest season, and then absent, leaving minimal traces in the parish records that constituted the official archive of village life. The social world these workers occupied was a liminal one. By structural definition, they lived at the edges of the landscape, in canvas shelters against hedgerows, in barns and outbuildings at the field's margin, and they moved through a community in which they were economically necessary but socially distinct. They were not, for the most part, recorded by name. They appear in estate accounts as labor costs, in parish records occasionally as the subjects of charity or concern, and in local memory in the more durable form of folk story. The gypsy woman tradition in the Pluckley folk record, the figure said to have died at the edge of the village near a particular tree, whose presence is reported near that location across many recorded accounts, belongs to this social history as much as to any supernatural one. A woman who died in a temporary camp at the margin between village and open field, in a period when such deaths were neither unexpected nor particularly well documented, would leave exactly the kind of trace that folk tradition preserves: a location, a circumstance that is felt rather than specified, and a presence that outlasts any official record of the person. The specificity of the location matters in this tradition. Not a ghost of the lane, not a ghost of the village, but a ghost of a particular tree, a particular old oak at the field edge. Its roots spread into the clay at the boundary between the managed world of the village and the open ground beyond. That specificity is not ornamental. In the folk belief system documented by the Folklore Society collectors, a spirit attached to a specific location was attached there by the circumstances of its death and by the properties of the place itself. The tree at the boundary was already a significant location in the folk understanding of the landscape. A death at that location would be understood as significant in a way that a death 50 yards further into the open field would not be. The tree gives the tradition its anchor, and the tradition gives the tree its name. The persistence of English folk beliefs about the earthbound dead, across many centuries of documented record, is one of the things that makes the Weald's traditions particularly legible to researchers. The core structure of the belief is consistent: a soul that died in violent or unresolved circumstances, or a soul that was not properly tended in the religious sense, remained near the site of its death, rather than moving through the expected progression of the afterlife into whatever came next. This was not understood as punishment, exactly. It was more like a mechanical consequence, a result of the interruption of a process that, when completed correctly, would have carried the spirit somewhere else. The soul did not choose to remain. It simply could not complete the journey, and so it stayed where the journey had stopped. This pattern is present in nearly every named tradition associated with Pluckley: the woman who died searching the churchyard for a child she could not find, the worker whose dying moment at the brickworks was so sudden and so loud that the sound has not yet finished, the traveler who died at the roadside in cold or in injury, far enough from any parish record to go unnamed in official history. Each figure is fixed to a specific location by the circumstances of a specific event, and each location carries the character of that event forward in the way the clay of the Weald carries the shape of anything pressed into it long enough. The folk belief system did not invent these figures arbitrarily. It applied a consistent and internally coherent logic to specific places and specific deaths, producing a map of the landscape in which the history of human presence was legible at the level of individual trees and specific road bends. Kent's Assize records from the 16th and 17th centuries document witch trial prosecutions in a pattern broadly consistent with what researchers have found in other English counties, though with regional characteristics that reflect the particular social tensions of the Weald. The prosecutions typically centered on women whose knowledge of herbs, healing practices, and what the records called divination placed them at the boundary between approved religious practice and something that ecclesiastical and legal structures of the period were not equipped to accommodate within that approved framework. A woman who knew which plants eased a fever, which words were said over a sick animal, and which patterns in the landscape were significant, was useful to her community in ways that the parish church could not easily replicate. She was also, by the standards of the period's institutional logic, a problem. The assize records are careful and businesslike documents. The clerks who wrote them were not performing horror. They were recording legal proceedings with the same detachment that they brought to disputes over land boundaries and unpaid debts. A woman accused of bewitching livestock in a village in the Ashford district appears in the record as a subject of examination and judgment, her name noted, the charge specified, the witnesses listed, the outcome recorded. What the record does not contain, because it was not the record's function to contain it, is the social context in which her knowledge had been sought and relied upon for years before the accusation, or the community relationships that made the accusation possible, or the folk world in which her practices had been understood, not as deviance, but as skill. Alongside the prosecuted and the accused, Kent had a well-documented tradition of cunning folk, practitioners who offered services to individuals and communities in the management of problems that the official institutional world did not address. Their services included the identification of thieves, the treatment of bewitched livestock, the interpretation of unusual events in the landscape, and among the most consistently documented of their functions, the laying of troublesome ghosts. A cunning man or woman consulted for this purpose would assess the nature of the haunting, the location, the reported behavior of the presence, the circumstances of the death that had produced it, and prescribe or perform whatever action was understood to address the specific case. The prescription might involve particular words, particular objects placed at the site, or particular actions carried out at significant times. This was not a marginal or secretive practice in the Weald of the 17th and 18th centuries. The cunning folk operated openly enough to appear in documentary records, including in legal proceedings where their activities were sometimes challenged and sometimes appealed to as evidence. And where a community that could not afford to bring in a church official for every unexplained event in the landscape had, in the cunning man or woman, a locally available alternative that operated within the same fundamental cosmology, the same understanding of spirit, place, and the consequences of unresolved death that produced the ghost traditions in the first place. The two were not in opposition. They were complementary expressions of the same belief system, one producing the problem and one providing the framework for addressing it. The geographic range of cunning folk services in Kent overlapped significantly with the communities in which the folk ghost traditions were most densely documented. This was not a coincidence of any mysterious kind. It was a consequence of the fact that both the traditions and the practitioners emerged from the same social world, the same clay-heavy landscape, the same set of questions about what happened to people who died badly and what the living were supposed to do about it. The folklore society collectors arriving in the 1870s and 1880s were documenting the late survivals of a world in which the relationship between the living and the dead in a specific place was understood as something that required active management, not passive acceptance. The folklore society's fieldwork established something that later researchers in both folklore studies and environmental psychology would find independently significant. The persistence of a belief tradition is not evidence of the belief's accuracy, but it is evidence of the belief's utility. A tradition that survives across multiple generations in a community has survived because it does something, because it provides a framework for understanding events that would otherwise be unassimilated, or because it creates a structure of attention to specific places that organizes the community's relationship to its landscape in ways that are practically useful. The ghost at the crossroads keeps a certain kind of attention on a dangerous road. The presence at the boundary tree marks the boundary as significant. The screaming at the brickworks preserves the memory of a death that the official record may not have retained. This is not a cynical account of folk tradition. The question of whether the utility of a belief is distinct from its truth is a question that neither the Folklore Society collectors nor their successors have found it easy to resolve, and the difficulty of resolving it is itself worth holding carefully. A tradition that has been useful for long enough begins to accumulate its own evidence, specific experiences, specific reports, specific places where something happened that no one who was there found easy to explain. The Weald's clay holds the shape of things pressed into it. The folk tradition holds the shape of things that happened in the landscape and were not otherwise preserved. By the 19th century, the world in which cunning folk operated was beginning to contract. The Burial of Suicide Act of 1823 had already removed one of the most publicly visible expressions of the folk belief system, the crossroads burial, from legal practice. The gradual expansion of literacy, the Methodist revival, the increasing reach of institutional medicine, bidding the reorganization of rural labor that accompanied agricultural enclosure, all worked to reduce the social space in which the cunning folk services were understood as natural and necessary. The practitioners did not disappear immediately. The records show them still active in Kentish market towns and villages well into the latter half of the 19th century, still consulted for the same range of services, still operating within the same cosmological framework, but the world that had produced them with confidence and placed them without contradiction in the social fabric of Weald villages was becoming, in the period the Folklore Society was documenting it, a world in the process of becoming something else. The collectors arrived, in other words, at a particular moment, late enough to find the traditions, as things already being named and recorded, rather than simply lived, but not so late that the living carriers of those traditions were entirely absent. The notebook from the 1878 Kentish visit records a woman who spoke about the stream crossing in the present tense. It had this quality, it required this attention, but who also noted that her children did not use the same vocabulary she did when they spoke about the same location. The transition was visible in a single conversation, in the gap between one generation's matter-of-fact description and the next generation's polite incomprehension. The stream crossing the 1878 collector recorded is not, as far as anyone has been able to establish, the same location as any of the named Pluckley ghost traditions. The woman and the collector are not part of Pluckley's documented history. They are part of the surrounding landscape, the wider Weald in which Pluckley sits, the same clay geology, the same pattern of villages, the same social world of hop pickers and cunning folk and folklore society visitors with notebooks and letters of introduction. And Pluckley's specific ghost traditions grew from this same ground. They are local expressions of a regional pattern that was itself a local expression of something older still, distributed across the English countryside in the forms that each local landscape and each local social history gave it. The seasonal rhythms of the hop harvest shaped the social calendar of villages like Pluckley in ways that persisted long after hop cultivation itself declined. The annual arrival of large numbers of workers from outside the region created a period of heightened social activity at the margins of village life, at the field edges and lane sides, and temporary camps where the harvest workers lived for the duration of the season. Folk stories circulate particularly well in such conditions. A death in a temporary camp reported among a community of workers who will shortly disperse across London and Ireland and wherever else they came from, will not be preserved in a parish record. It will be preserved in exactly the kind of mobile oral tradition that hop workers carried with them, a story about a specific place attached to a specific event, carried back to its origin the following season by people who had heard it elsewhere and brought it home. The assize records, the cunning folk consultations, the folklore society notebooks, the hop harvest accounts, these are different kinds of evidence for the same underlying world. They are documents produced by different institutions for different purposes, each one capturing a fragment of a social and spiritual landscape that no single document contains in full. The ghost traditions of Pluckley are not explicable from any one of these sources alone. They make most sense when they are understood as arising from all of them simultaneously, from a landscape in which particular places carried particular histories, in which the dead were understood to remain near the site of their deaths until something released them, in which certain practitioners were employed specifically to carry out that release, and in which the seasonal movement of workers through the village brought new stories and new deaths into contact with an existing structure of belief that was ready to receive and preserve them. The same landscape that produced the ghost stories also produced, in the same period and from the same community, a documented class of people whose entire function was to respond to them. The cunning folk did not study the ghost traditions from a distance. They worked within them, applying their knowledge of specific locations and specific circumstances to specific cases that their neighbors brought to them. A ghost reported at a crossroads required one kind of attention. A ghost at a boundary tree required another. A sound at a brickworks, persistent and unexplained across multiple seasons, would have been a recognizable category of case to a Kentish cunning man or woman of the 17th century, a soul that had not completed its journey from the place where the journey had stopped, waiting in the clay of the Weald for whatever it needed in order to move. What it needed according to the belief system that produced both the ghost traditions and the practitioners who addressed them was not evidence or investigation. It needed acknowledgement, a recognition, in the specific language the tradition provided, that something had happened at this specific place, that the person who had died there was known, that the living were aware of the weight the landscape was carrying, and were prepared to address it with the seriousness it deserved. Whether that acknowledgement did what the tradition claimed it did is not a question the documentary record answers. The record shows only that it was sought and offered and recorded by the same careful clerks and notebook keepers who recorded everything else. The world that needed the cunning folk was the same world that produced the ghosts. Both were expressions of the same long attention to the same clay-heavy ground. In the years after 1952, the ground where Surrendon Daring had stood was quiet in the way that cleared ground always is, not empty, exactly, but held in a particular kind of suspension, the way a room feels after furniture has been carried out and before anything new has been brought in. The fire that destroyed the house did not leave a ruin. It left a foundation outline and a walled garden beginning its long drift back into itself, and at a field's distance, the estate cottages still stood with their rounded arched windows catching whatever light the Kentish sky offered, which on most days was a pale and diffuse light, the kind that does not cast strong shadows. The house that had given those windows their meaning was gone. The windows remained. The Daring family had been the architectural and institutional fact behind Pluckley for the better part of 700 years. Their monuments ran along the nave walls of St. Nicholas Church. Their name had been attached to the advowson, to the estate cottages, to the particular visual idiom of arched and oval frames that made the village immediately distinguishable to anyone who had once seen it. The fire of 1952 ended the family's presence as a living institution in that landscape, not with any drama the records particularly dwell upon, but with the plain irreversibility that fire tends to produce. What had stood for centuries was not standing anymore. What remained? The church, the cottages, the lanes, the clay-heavy fields, was still there, carrying the weight of the association forward without the center it had organized around. The village did not stop. That is the simplest thing to say about Pluckley in the period after Daring's destruction, and it is also, in its quiet way, the most telling. The lanes remained narrow, the hedgerows pressed close on both sides, in the way they always had. St. Nicholas Church received its visitors and its worshippers and its occasional researchers, its interior unchanged in the ways that matter, the ledger stones underfoot, the light through the east window, making the same path across the nave floor it had made every clear morning for several centuries. The ghost traditions, for their part, did not require Daring to persist. They were already attached to other places, to the churchyard, to the field edge, to the road bend, to the overgrown brickwork site, and those places were all still present and unchanged, and the stories that had grown around them continued to circulate. What science has offered to that circulation is not a verdict, but a set of additional facts, and the facts are worth holding alongside the reported experiences with the same quality of attention one might bring to the experiences themselves. Vic Tandy was a scientist at Coventry University who published findings in the late 1990s arising from work he had initially begun because of his own anomalous experience, a sense of unease, a peripheral visual disturbance, a felt presence in a laboratory that turned out to be producing a standing wave of infrasound at a frequency of 1898 hertz. The frequency itself is of interest. At or near 18 hertz, infrasound, sound below the threshold of human hearing, can produce in the bodies of people who do not know it is present, a physiological state that includes unease, a sense that something is wrong, disturbances at the edge of vision, and a feeling that has been described by research subjects as a presence in the room. No sound is heard, no source is identified. The body simply responds as it responds to things it has not been told to expect. Tandy's findings, published in the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research, identified a physical mechanism by which old buildings, stone churches, industrial structures, enclosed ruins with particular acoustic properties, could generate precisely the range of perceptual experiences that witnesses report in allegedly haunted locations. The resonance frequencies of human eyeballs, which sit close to 18 hertz, mean that standing infrasound waves of sufficient amplitude can produce peripheral visual disturbances that are physiologically real. Something is seen at the edge of vision that is not a fabrication or a misattribution, but an artifact of the body's own acoustic response to its environment. St. Nicholas Church, stone-built and centuries old, with the particular enclosed acoustic properties of medieval ecclesiastical architecture, has never been formally surveyed for infrasound. The finding does not establish that all reported experiences there have a single physical cause. It establishes that the physical environment of a building of that type and that age is capable of producing anomalous perceptual states in people who are not expecting them and do not know the mechanism that is producing them. What this adds to the account of Pluckley is not a dismissal. It is a parallel description, a different register of the same landscape. The church still stands. The reported experiences are still part of the record. The infrasound research is also part of the record. The infrasound research is also part of the record. These things sit alongside one another without requiring resolution, and the failure to resolve them is not a failure of the investigation, but simply the current state of what is known. Richard Wiseman's research introduced a different set of considerations, working from the psychological rather than the acoustic end of the question. Wiseman, a psychologist whose work on perception and anomalous experience produced findings that have been cited in the literature of haunted location research for more than 2 decades, conducted investigations at several locations with established haunting reputations, Edinburgh's underground vaults among the most extensively documented, and found a consistent and replicable result. Subjects placed in environments that had been arbitrarily designated as areas of likely anomalous activity by researchers without any basis in the historical record of the location reported anomalous experiences at higher rates than subjects placed in areas that the historical record had consistently associated with paranormal accounts. The designation mattered. The expectation mattered. The prior framing of what was likely to happen in a space had a measurable effect on what people subsequently reported experiencing in that space. This finding does not establish that every reported experience in a haunted location is the product of expectation. What it establishes is that expectation is a variable, a real and measurable variable, that has to be accounted for when evaluating reports from locations where the reputation of the place is known to the people reporting the experiences. Pluckley's 12 named locations have been described in print, in television programs, in online ghost hunting event listings, and in the accounts of previous investigators for long enough that almost no one arrives at those locations without knowing what is supposed to happen there. The screaming man is supposed to be heard at the brickworks. The white lady is supposed to appear near the interior of St. Nicholas Church. Fright Corner is supposed to produce the sensation of a threatening presence. Anyone who has read the accounts before visiting already knows where to attend and what the reported experience is supposed to feel like. Wiseman's finding places that prior knowledge inside the interpretive frame rather than outside it. There is a third set of considerations that belongs particularly to the way Pluckley is currently experienced, which is mostly through overnight paranormal investigation events. The sleep architecture of people who remain awake through the night in an unfamiliar place under conditions of moderate anxiety and heightened attentiveness is a documented area of neurological research with findings that are directly relevant to what gets reported in those investigations. The transition between waking and sleep, the hypnagogic state, is a neurological threshold at which the brain produces vivid hallucinations that are, to the person experiencing them, perceptually indistinguishable from waking experience. Figures appear, voices are heard. A sense of presence is felt, sometimes with physical weight or pressure. These experiences are not disorders and not fabrications. They are the ordinary productions of a brain moving through a boundary state, and they are more frequent, more vivid, and more intense in people who are fatigued, who are operating in unfamiliar environments, and who are under conditions of heightened arousal. An overnight event at Pluckley satisfies all three conditions reliably. The participants are fatigued by the late hour. The environment is unfamiliar, old stone buildings in darkness, overgrown industrial sites, open lanes after midnight. The anxiety level is elevated, not by dread, but by the specific quality of attention that people bring to locations they have been told are haunted, a kind of focused readiness that primes the nervous system to notice. In these conditions, the hypnagogic state intrudes more readily into waking experience, and the experiences it produces, heard voices, seen figures, felt presences, are reported by participants as occurring during moments when they believed themselves fully awake. The neurological record and the eyewitness report look, from the outside, indistinguishable. The participant's account is genuine. The mechanism is documented. The two facts coexist. None of this places a closed cover over the case file. The infrasound research identifies a mechanism without surveying Pluckley's specific locations. The confirmation bias research establishes the relevance of prior expectation without demonstrating that every report in every location is wholly produced by expectation. The hypnagogic research describes what the brain produces under specific conditions without establishing that those conditions obtained in every individual instance of every reported experience across decades of accounts. The documented science and the reported accounts both sit in the file, equally present, neither subordinating the other. The folklorists Gillian Bennett and Paul Smith described the development of haunting legends in small communities through a process that their research traced across multiple English examples, finding a consistent cycle with recognizable stages. Initial reports accumulate around locations that have experienced traumatic events, around places that carry particular emotional weight in the community's shared history, or around figures, charismatic individuals, local historians, particular families, whose interpretive authority organizes the accounts into a recognizable shape. The stories that survive are not necessarily the most dramatic or the most frequently reported. They are the stories that find the right social environment, the right teller, the right audience, the right moment in the community's relationship with its own past. They persist because something about them fits the needs of the people who carry them. In Pluckley, the social environment that preserved and amplified the ghost traditions was unusually rich. The Darking family's centuries-long dominance of the village gave the legends an architectural and institutional frame that most haunted villages lack. The rounded windows were not only a visual curiosity, but a standing reminder of the family whose women were said to walk the churchyard, whose funeral arrangements were said to have included the extraordinary detail of multiple nested coffins. The hop cultivation and brick production that shaped the village's economy also shaped its social world, bringing large numbers of seasonal and itinerant workers through a landscape that, at the margins, accumulated the stories of people who passed through without leaving documentary records. Stories like the Gypsy Woman's, which attached itself to a specific tree at the field edge and remained attached there across generations of telling. The Black Horse Inn provided the social space within which the accounts circulated, were disputed, were augmented, and were passed to the next wave of visitors who arrived with questions and left with the same stories they had been given, carried now as personal knowledge rather than received information. The Bennett and Smith model describes the eventual phase of this cycle as the fixing of the tradition in canonical form, a moment when the variable, contested, locally specific accounts consolidate into a numbered list, a named roster, a publicly recognized count that resists further revision because it has been printed and reprinted enough times to become in the public record simply what is true. For Pluckley, that moment was the Guinness World Records entry, 12 ghosts, the most haunted village in England, printed in a reference book in a typeface that made no distinction between this claim and the height of a mountain or the wingspan of a bird. The number was not the product of a formal survey. The researchers who had tried to count the traditions had found that the count could reasonably sit below 12 or above it, depending on how the overlapping and variant accounts were categorized. But 12 was what was printed, and 12 is what has been cited in every subsequent news article, every ghost hunting event listing, every tourism website that mentions Pluckley in the same sentence as the word haunted. The number now belongs to the landscape in a way that the landscape cannot easily refuse. Fright Corner is marked on the Ordnance Survey map. The 12 is in the Guinness record. Both are as firmly placed in the official documentation of this particular stretch of the Kent Weald as the field boundaries or the names of the lanes, and both arrived at their fixed form through processes that are, once examined, less straightforward than the printed result suggests. The map's topography reflects centuries of land use. The ghost count reflects decades of local testimony and journalistic reiteration. Both are real in the sense that they have consequences. They shape how the place is navigated, who comes to it, what is expected, what is found. The open case file on the laptop screen, the one that belongs to the ghost hunting company, whose overnight event at Pluckley has not yet produced its written report, contains, if it is a representative file of its kind, several categories of material that have been sorted into folders and labeled by location. The audio recordings are time-stamped. The timestamps indicate which recordings came from the church, which from the brickworks, which from the road near Fright Corner. The thermal images are sorted similarly, each image a representation of heat distribution across a space, the cooler greens and blues of stone and open ground, the warmer signatures of the investigators themselves moving through the frame. The analysis has been started. The anomalous events, the sound that resembled a voice, the drop in temperature near the north wall, the peripheral movement that two participants reported at the same moment from different angles, have been flagged in the files, each one waiting for the written report that will decide what language to use for it. The language used in these reports is its own study. The careful ones use hedged constructions. An audio recording produced a sound consistent with a human voice. Participants reported visual anomalies in the northeast corner of the Nive. Thermal data showed a temperature differential of 3 degrees Celsius in an area with no identified source of cooling. The constructions are precise. They commit to what was recorded and decline to commit to what the recordings mean. This hedged language is not evasion. It is, in its way, the correct response to material that has not yet been explained and may not have a single explanation. And the investigators who write it are doing something honest, holding the evidence at the edge of what the evidence actually establishes and not carrying it further than it will go. The file will be completed. The report will be written. It will be uploaded to the company's website and cataloged alongside the reports from previous Pluckley events, and the archive of Pluckley investigations will grow by one more entry, and the village will have been visited and recorded again, and the recordings will sit in their folders waiting for someone to look at them again, which someone eventually will. This is how the documentation continues, not through resolution, but through accumulation, layer on layer, account on account, each one adding to a record that is very long and very detailed and does not yet, taken as a whole, arrive at a single clear answer about the specific quality of what happens in these particular lanes at night, in this church, in this field. The church itself, St. Nicholas, which has stood in roughly its current form for several centuries, carries the during monuments along its naive walls in the quiet way that parish churches carry the physical residue of the families that shaped them. The ledger stones in the floor mark other burials. The east window admits the same light it has admitted since it was glazed, a soft and particular light that falls on the stone floor of the nave in the early morning before any visitor arrives. When the church is empty in the way that empty buildings are not quite empty, occupied by their own acoustic properties, by the sound of stone contracting in the cold, by whatever infrasound the structure generates or conducts from the ground beneath it, by the quality of attention that very old buildings tend to produce in the people who sit quietly inside them. The daring monuments have no power to make ghosts. They are carved stone, carefully worked, representing in formal poses the members of a family who exercised considerable influence over this small patch of Kent for a long time and then did not, the family seat destroyed by fire and the physical institution dissolved. What the monuments do is mark the place as one where memory has been formally invested, where the material world was deliberately shaped to carry something of the past forward into an uncertain future. This is what monuments are for. Whether the investment persisted in any form beyond the stone and the carved inscription is a question that the monuments cannot answer, and that the documented record has not answered. And the question remains where it has always been, open without a bottom, the kind of question that a very old place simply carries as part of its weight. The lanes of Pluckley, narrow and damp and pressed close by their hedgerows, are quiet at night in the specific way of Kentish lanes that run between working farms. There is always something moving, an animal in the field, wind through the hedgerow, the particular sound of a lane settling its clay surface after rain. The silence between the sounds is not an absence. It is the background condition against which the sounds occur, and it is deep enough that small sounds carry further than they would in a louder landscape. The investigators who walk these lanes after midnight with their electromagnetic field meters and their audio recorders are walking through a landscape that produces sounds and temperature variations and atmospheric effects because it is a living physical environment, and they are also walking through a landscape that has been described as inhabited, for as long as anyone can trace the tradition, by presences that the physical description does not fully account for. Both descriptions are real. The physical landscape and the recorded traditions are both part of Pluckley, and neither one cancels the other, and the village continues with both of them held inside it. The hop gardens still grow in their season, though the harvest no longer brings the seasonal workers who camped in rows of canvas shelters along the field edges. The clay-heavy soil still marks the boots of anyone who walks the footpaths after rain. The brickwork site at Pinnock is overgrown, but the clay pits are still there beneath the vegetation, and the earthworks that remain are substantial enough that wind moving through them produces sounds the audio recorders pick up and file and label and sometimes cannot account for. The oak at the village edge, old enough that the bark has the deep texture of age, the roots spreading wide through the clay, stands at the field margin, as it has stood for longer than the ghost tradition attached to it can be traced, and the leaves fall from it each autumn in the same way they always have, and gather at its roots. What happens at the boundary between the documented and the unexplained is not a confrontation. The scientific research and the eyewitness accounts and the folklore traditions and the parish records and the infrasound measurements and the thermal images are all deposited in the same archive. The full, complicated, unresolved record of a small village in Kent that has been looked at very carefully by a great many people for a long time. The looking has not produced a conclusion. What it has produced is a very detailed picture of a place that is, at its physical level, a modest agricultural settlement with distinctive estate architecture and a history of clay-based industry and a medieval church full of carved stone memorials. And that is, at the same time, a place that carries 12 named presences, or fewer, or more, depending on how the counting is done, each one attached to a specific location by a tradition that has been circulating in various forms for longer than the record can establish a starting point. The record does not go all the way back. That is one of the plain facts about Pluckley's ghost traditions. No one can establish with documentary precision where the oldest accounts originated, what the earliest surviving version of any particular legend looked like, whether the White Lady was attached to St. Nicholas Church before the Daring family's particular prominence gave her story an institutional frame, or whether the Gypsy Woman's tree was named and storied before the hop harvests began, bringing large numbers of travelers through the village in the 16th century. The traditions are older than the documentation, which is itself older than the journalistic accounts, which are older than the Guinness entry, which is older than the overnight investigation industry, and each layer rests on the one beneath it, without being able to see all the way through to the bottom. What sits at the bottom, what the earliest version of any of these stories looked like when it was first told, by whom, in what circumstances, about what specific event or specific person, is not recoverable. The archive has a floor, and below the floor is the period before records were kept in a form that survived. And in that period, the stories were already circulating in a landscape that had been inhabited and worked and traversed for a very long time. And the people who told the stories and the people who heard them are not in any record that can now be consulted. The story of a woman who died beside a tree at the field edge and whose presence continued to be associated with that tree afterward is older in its general form than Pluckley. Emil, older than Kent, as old as the practice of attaching the memory of the dead to specific places in the landscape that will outlast the living who remember them. The village that carries 12 ghosts in its official record is, in this way, doing something that villages have always done, holding the past in the landscape, in the buildings, in the stories that move from one generation of tellers to the next, in the trees and the lane names and the bends in the road that took their character from events that happened once and then became permanent features of the place. Fright Corner took its name from something. The something is not recoverable in its specific historical form, but the name is on the map, and the map is what people use to navigate, and the navigation carries the name forward into the future, regardless of whether the event that produced it can be recovered or verified or explained. The fire-cleared ground of Surrendon Daring has been covered by decades of weather and growth since 1952. The foundation outline that was visible in the first years after the fire has become, over time, something softer, a slight variation in the way vegetation grows, a difference in what the ground produces, a faint unevenness that a person who knew what had been there might recognize, and a person who did not might not notice. The house is not there. The memory of the house is in the estate cottages, in the church monuments, in the local histories that note its loss and describe what it had been. The rounded windows of the surviving cottages still catch the morning light. They will catch it tomorrow morning, as they have caught it every morning since they were built, and the low gray light of a Kentish morning does not distinguish between the buildings whose institutional context remains and those whose context was removed by a fire more than 70 years ago. The case file on the laptop screen sits with its folders still open